Mother Bear's cubs are trapped on flooding island. What happened next left everyone in tears. In the quiet serenity of the wilderness, the sky was a calm blue, and the forest hummed with the subtle sounds of nature. The air was crisp, and the morning light filtered through the towering trees, illuminating the life that flourished on this small, remote island. The river, which wound its way around the island, had always been a source of life. But this morning was different. The air felt heavy, the birds seemed quieter, and a strange tension hung in the atmosphere. Masha, the mother bear, a giant of powerful muscles and maternal grace, stirred as she woke in her den. Her two cubs, Sasha and Misha, were still fast asleep by her side. The forest was her world, and she moved through it with quiet strength. Her fur was a deep brown, and her eyes were filled with the protective instinct that only a mother could understand. Every step she took through the wilderness was a step made with her cubs in mind, protecting them from the many dangers of the wild. But today, there was something in the air that made her uneasy. She had been through storms before, but nothing had ever felt like this. The river was swollen, the usual gentle flow now a dangerous torrent. She could hear the distant rumble of thunder, the sky darkening ominously as clouds gathered. The cubs stirred, stretching as the morning light began to filter in, but the warmth of the sun was quickly replaced by the cold breath of the coming storm. Sasha rubbed her eyes, her soft fur still matted from sleep, and looked around curiously. She was younger than Misha, more playful, always eager to explore the world. But today, even she could sense something was off. The winds had picked up, and there was an unfamiliar chill in the air. As the storm clouds gathered overhead, Masha knew that they needed to move. She led her cubs down to the riverbank, the water now swelling higher than usual, lapping dangerously at the edges of the forest. The familiar sound of the river was now a menacing roar, and the trees above began to sway as the first drops of rain began to fall. But before Masha could get her cubs to safety, the water rose quickly. What had been a steady stream was now a raging force, spilling over its banks and swallowing up the land. Panic set in as the bear family scrambled for higher ground. Masha could feel her heart racing in her chest as she nudged her cubs toward a rocky outcrop. The rain poured down in sheets, the thunder cracking above them, and the river surged forward, swallowing everything in its path. Masha's instincts screamed for her to get her cubs to safety, but with the rising water, even the highest ground was no longer safe. She looked around desperately, but the island was quickly becoming an island no more, swallowed by the flood. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with others who need a dose of inspiration. The water level was rising faster than Masha had ever seen before. It wasn't just the river that was dangerous, it was the sheer force of the water, the floodwaters moving in from all sides, threatening to consume everything. Masha tried to stay calm as she nudged her cubs further uphill. The island seemed to shrink with every passing moment. Asha! Misha! Masha called urgently, her deep, worried voice trembling with the strain of the rising flood. Move quickly. The cubs obeyed, but Sasha was too small to understand the full danger. She wanted to explore, to frolic in the water, but Masha's sharp growl silenced her playful curiosity. The rain came down harder now, and the wind whipped through the trees, bending them at unnatural angles. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, but it was soon overwhelmed by the rush of water, drowning out all other sounds. Masha's claws dug into the muddy ground as she climbed higher, her muscles straining with the effort. The cubs were close behind, their little legs struggling to keep up with their mother's urgency. At the top of the small outcrop, Masha paused, looking back. The river was now a fast-moving torrent, and the landscape that she had known her whole life was being swallowed by the flood. Masha growled low in her throat, a mix of frustration and fear. The storm was too strong, the water too high. She knew that if they couldn't get off this island soon, they would be trapped, perhaps forever. But there was no escape. The island was small, and as the floodwaters continued to rise, the family was left with nowhere to go. Masha huddled her cubs close to her, trying to shield them from the pouring rain and the cold wind. Sasha and Misha clung to her, their eyes wide with fear. Masha had always been a protector, always able to provide for her cubs, but in that moment she felt helpless. The storm had taken control, and there was no place to run, no place to hide. As the floodwaters continued to rise, Masha's heart pounded with terror. There was no way out. Far from the chaos of the island, a group of animals had already begun to sense that something was wrong. Gavril, the older bear who lived in the nearby forest, had seen the storm clouds gathering in the distance. As a seasoned survivor of the wilderness, he knew that this storm was unlike any other. His sharp instincts told him that something was wrong, and he set off toward the island immediately, his massive form moving quickly through the woods. Along the way, Gavril was joined by Lena, a clever and compassionate wolf who had also sensed the rising danger. Lena had known Masha for years, and she had always admired the young mother bear's strength and determination. When she saw the storm's intensity, she knew Masha would need help. As the storm raged on, more animals joined the rescue effort. A group of ravens, led by a wise old bird named Tanya, flew over the island, surveying the damage from above. Tanya could see that the island was nearly submerged, and she immediately called out to the other animals to hurry. The animals worked together in a way that no one had expected. The bears and wolves coordinated their efforts, with Lena and her pack leading the charge, while the ravens flew above, scouting the safest routes to reach the trapped cubs. As the storm continued to rage above, the floodwaters now completely surrounded the small patch of land where Masha and her cubs had taken refuge. The once quiet island had transformed into a frantic, swirling sea. Masha stood at the edge of the small hill, looking out over the water in despair. Her heart was heavy, and though she tried to stay calm for the sake of her cubs, the fear was palpable in her every movement. Sasha was trembling, her small frame barely able to handle the cold and the storm. Misha, who was a bit older, was quieter, his big brown eyes wide with confusion. The cubs huddled together under their mother's protective presence, but the rising floodwaters showed no sign of relenting. Masha turned her gaze back toward the forest, hoping for a miracle. She felt a wave of helplessness wash over her. The storm was too fierce, the water too high. There seemed to be no way out. But then, through the mist and rain, she saw them. Gavril, the elder bear, and Lena, the wolf, emerging from the trees. For a moment, Masha felt as if the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. But the reality of their situation came crashing back almost immediately. They were still trapped. The water was too deep, the ground too unstable. "We'll get you out, Masha," Gavril's deep voice rumbled. "Hold on. Help is on the way." Asha, though relieved, could feel the strain in her limbs. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on. But as the animals approached, she saw that they were not alone. Behind them, a group of riverside animals, including beavers, otters, and even the swift-footed deer, had joined the trapped cubs. The group held up a hand, a sign for her to pull out, and on empathy, she simply shrugged. Lena, swift and agile, began coordinating the efforts. She turned to Masha and said, "We'll create a path for you to follow. Stay close to us, and we'll get your cubs to safety." With Gavril's strength and the unity of the animals, they began their perilous journey across the flooded land. The ground was unstable, and every step was a gamble. The wolves and beavers cleared paths through the brush, while the otters scouted the water's edge, making sure the flooded paths were safe. At first, Masha hesitated. The floodwaters were deep and the current was strong. But the sight of her cubs clinging to her, eyes wide with fear, gave her the courage to push forward. Every instinct within her screamed to stay close, to not venture out into the unknown. But the sight of her animal friends working together, bears, wolves, and even the small animals of the river, reminded her that this was their chance. It was their only chance. The water rose higher, the swift current threatening to drag them away, but the animals held strong. A beaver named Max had fashioned a makeshift raft from fallen logs, which they used to ferry the cubs to higher ground. Masha climbed onto the raft, her claws digging into the logs for stability. With one cub held close to her side and the other carefully balanced between them, she moved cautiously across the water. The raft creaked and groaned under the weight of the animals, but the journey was far from over. There were still dangerous swamps to navigate, steep hills to climb, and more rising floodwaters to contend with. But Masha's heart swelled with hope. Her community was helping her, and they would not stop until her cubs were safe. Sasha was quiet now, her little body huddled against Masha, trying to stay warm, while Misha's exhaustion showed in the way he clung to his mother, too tired to speak. Masha could feel their weight, their vulnerability, and with every step they took, her heart grew heavier. She was terrified, but she knew she couldn't stop. They were so close. As they neared the forest's edge, the path became more treacherous. Trees were felled across the ground, remnants of the storm's fury, and the waters had turned the soil into a slippery, unstable surface. Masha's claws scraped against the wet rocks and mud as she moved forward, her muscles sore and trembling. But she refused to stop. For her cubs, she would do anything. Suddenly, as they approached a dangerous bend in the water, a new danger emerged. A huge log, carried by the current, slammed into the raft, knocking it sideways. For a terrifying moment, Masha felt the raft tipping, the cold water rushing up around her. She heard Sasha's frightened cry as the raft tilted dangerously. But Gavril, quick and steady, rushed to the rescue. With one powerful paw, he stabilized the raft, pushing it back into position and keeping it from tipping completely. He growled, his voice calm yet filled with authority. "Hold on, Masha. We're almost there." With the strength of the entire group, they finally reached the higher ground. The floodwaters, although still rising, could no longer threaten them. Masha, her heart pounding with relief, finally allowed herself a moment to breathe as she looked at her cubs safe and sound in her arms. The storm began to lose its ferocity, the rain turning into a light drizzle as the clouds started to part. The once threatening river had slowed, but the island was still submerged, the land scarred by the floodwaters. Masha and her cubs were finally safe, but the exhaustion weighed heavily on her. Masha sat down on solid ground, cradling her cubs close. Her fur was matted and wet, and her limbs trembled from the stress of the ordeal. But the look in Sasha and Misha's eyes, wide with relief, was all she needed to see. Her heart swelled with overwhelming emotion as she nuzzled her cubs, the fear from earlier now replaced with a profound sense of gratitude. They had made it. Against all odds, her cubs were safe, and they were together. Lena, ever the optimist, stood by, her tail wagging softly. "You did it, Masha. You kept them safe, and now we're all here." Masha looked around at the faces of the animals who had come to her aid. Gavril, Lena, Max the beaver, Tanya the raven, and the others who had risked their lives to help her. The bond of the forest had never felt so strong. One by one, the animals began to disperse, knowing their job was done. The rain had finally stopped, the sun beginning to peek through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the drenched land. Masha stayed for a moment, her eyes soft, her heart full of thanks. Finally, she rose to her feet, her cubs at her side. "We should move," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength, "but we will never forget what you've done for us." As they moved off into the clearing, Masha felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. She had faced the storm, and she had survived. Her cubs were safe, and, more than that, she had learned that there was power in unity, the power of community, of helping each other, even in the darkest moments. The storm had passed, but the island would never be the same. The floodwaters had left their mark, washing away much of what had once been familiar. But life, as it always does, would return. The earth would heal, and the river would find its course once more. And for Masha, Sasha, and Misha, this was the beginning of a new chapter. As they wandered through the forest, Masha's senses were alive with the joy of survival. Her cubs, though tired, were alive and curious again. They looked up at her with the trust only a child could have, and Masha knew she had given them a future. The storm had tested them, but it had also brought them closer together, forging a bond stronger than ever before. In the quiet that followed the storm, Masha knew that they would continue to survive, together, against whatever nature would throw at them. "I'm gonna bang her, Chris," Masha said. And as the sun set, casting golden hues across the water, Masha and her cubs disappeared into the forest, ready for whatever new adventures awaited them. As the story of Masha and her cubs comes to a close, we are reminded of the incredible resilience of the animal kingdom, where even the fiercest storms cannot break the bonds of love and survival. If you were moved by this story, make sure to subscribe for more heartwarming tales of courage, survival, and hope. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with others who need a dose of inspiration. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.